You have exactly 2 hours to restore the encryption keys, Conrad, or I'm calling the federal authorities. This is corporate sabotage, and I will personally see to it that you spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. I looked at my phone, took a slow, deliberate sip of my lukewarm coffee, and replied, "That is an automated license expiration, Garrett. Read the contract." I hung up. 12 years before that phone call, the world looked very different. It was 2014, and Vespera Cryptics was nothing more than a drafty double-car garage in Palo Alto. The air smelled of lead solder, dust, and cheap convenience store coffee. My wife, Lydia, sat at a folding plastic table, managing our shoestring budget on a laptop with a cracked screen. Our son, Tristan, who was only 12 at the time, spent his weekends helping us zip-tie Ethernet cables and mount refurbished rack servers. We weren't trying to build a flashy social media app or a speculative tech bubble. We were solving a concrete, expensive problem, protecting database transactions in real time without causing system latency. I spent 18 hours a day writing the core C++ codebase for what would become Citing 8. Most enterprise encryption tools back then were bloated and slow. They sat high up in the application layer, dragging down database performance by 30 or 40%. Citing 8 was different. It sat directly at the driver level, intercepting payload writes before they ever touched the physical disk. We optimized the memory-mapped files and utilized direct input-output operations to encrypt data using AES 256 in Galois counter mode. Crucially, we designed the security architecture to be hardware-enforced. The encryption keys weren't stored in software configuration files. They were cryptographically bound to the physical partition UUID of an AWS Cloud HSM, a hardware-to-security module. To make any changes to the master encryption pipeline, you needed the offline master backup recovery seed, which was kept on a physical USB hardware token. Without it, the HSM partition would interpret any configuration alteration as a physical heist and lock down permanently. It was a security design built to prevent database hijacking. To regional banks and mid-sized logistics providers, Citing 8 was gold. It meant they could secure customer records, comply with federal regulations, and maintain sub-millisecond transaction speeds. By our third year, we had secured 20 enterprise clients. We were profitable, but we were exhausted. Lydia was handling billing, customer support, and tax filings all by herself. I was writing code and handling emergency system deployments at 3 in the morning. We reached a point where we couldn't scale without serious capital. That was when Pierce Hathaway walked into our lives. Pierce was a boutique investment broker who wore three-piece suits and carried himself with the smooth, unbothered confidence of someone who had never skipped a meal in his life. He told us he had the perfect partner to take Vespera Cryptics to the next level, a private equity firm called Ironclad Capital, managed by a man named Garrett Kincaid. A week later, we met Garrett in his office on the top floor of a glass tower in San Francisco. Garrett was sharp, polite, and carried a veneer of corporate professionalism. He didn't know the difference between a private cryptographic key and a door key, but he knew how to read a balance sheet. He offered us $5 million in exchange for a 30% equity stake. To Lydia and me, $5 million felt like safety. We signed the papers, but venture capital is never free. The moment the funds cleared, Garrett's legal team went to work. They restructured Vespera Cryptics, moving our incorporation from California to Delaware. They expanded the board of directors from 3 members to 5, bringing in 2 independent seats. Pierce Hathaway was appointed to one of those seats, presenting himself as a neutral mediator. As we grew, so did our infrastructure costs. We needed to expand our cloud presence on Amazon Web Services to support our new enterprise clients. Every time we needed additional capital, Garrett was ready with a solution. He structured Series B and Series C funding rounds. He presented them as routine, investor-friendly packages. I was buried under code updates, managing a team of 10 engineers, and trying to keep up with the product roadmap. Lydia raised concerns about the liquidation preferences and the voting drag-along clauses buried in the 100-page investor agreements. She warned me that we were losing ground, but Pierce Hathaway assured us it was standard industry practice. He told us it was the only way to attract the institutional clients we needed. I trusted him, and I wanted to focus on the technology. That was my mistake. By the time we closed our Series C round, my 60% voting control had been quietly chipped away, diluted down to 25%. Lydia's shares were diluted even further. I was still the CTO, and my face was still on the marketing materials. But the company no longer belonged to us. Ironclad Capital held 3 of the 5 board seats, giving them absolute authority over every major corporate's decision. Garrett Kincaid believed that with the board under his thumb, the technology was his to control. He was about to find out that a corporate resolution cannot override the laws of physics or the terms of a bilateral contract. The official announcement went out on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. Vespera Cryptics was being acquired by Meridian Union Bank in a transaction valued at $20 million. On paper, it was a massive victory. For Lydia and me, it was supposed to be the culmination of a decade of grueling labor. Under the terms of the merger agreement, my transition contract included a $5 million earn-out bonus and the accelerated vesting of 50,000 restricted stock units, valued at roughly $3 million. The only condition was that Centenax 8 had to be successfully integrated into Meridian's core transaction network and maintain a 99.9% database uptime during the first 90 days post-merger. I expected a complex integration phase. I did not expect a calculated execution. The day after the acquisition finalized, Garrett Kincaid called an emergency board meeting. I walked into the conference room expecting to discuss server migration schedules. Instead, I found Garrett, Pierce Hathaway, and a 28-year-old named Preston Cole. Preston wasn't a bumbling nepotism hire. He was a highly competent cloud architect recruited from a major tech firm, boasting a clean track record and a sharp, calculating demeanor. He was also Garrett's nephew, and he had been brought in to execute a very specific strategy. Conrad, as we transition Vespera Cryptics into Meridian Union's infrastructure, we need to align our leadership with their enterprise standards, Garrett said, his voice smooth, polite, and completely devoid of warmth. The board has voted to install Preston as the new Chief Technology Officer of the Integrated Division. Your current role as CTO of Vespera Cryptics is terminated. He pushed a folder across the mahogany table. It was a demotion to Special Advisor on Legacy Systems. The job description was a masterpiece of corporate bureaucracy. It stripped me of all managerial authority, blocked my access to our active repositories, and cut me out of the integration roadmap. "What about my team?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "We are streamlining the operations," Pierce Hathaway chimed in, adjusting his glasses. Tristan Mercer's role in system administration is being transitioned to a legacy support desk. Within 20 minutes of that meeting, Preston Cole issued Tristan a termination letter, citing a fabricated performance review based on standard corporate metrics. They were cleaning house, trying to isolate me and provoke a reaction. If I reacted aggressively or if I refused to cooperate, they would invoke the termination for cause clause in my contract. That would instantly void the $5 million earnout and the $3 million in RSUs, saving Ironclad Capital $8 million. Preston leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Conrad, under Meridian's compliance guidelines, we need you to hand over your primary administrative credentials for the AWS production environment and the master KMS keys. We are migrating the key management system from the dedicated physical cloud HSM clusters to software-based AWS KMS to cut infrastructure costs by 40%. I looked at Preston, then at Garrett. Preston was smart, but he was a cloud native who viewed hardware as an unnecessary relic of the past. He didn't understand that Centenax 8 was built with hardware-enforced policies. The master encryption keys were bound directly to the physical partition UUID of the cloud HSM. Any software-based migration attempt without the offline master backup recovery seed, which was kept on a physical USB hardware token, would trigger an automatic lockout of the HSM partition. I could have warned him. I could have explained that bypassing the cloud HSM would trigger a hardware-level lockdown, but Garrett's lawyers had drafted my new contract to ensure I had no operational input. I was a special advisor, paid to speak only when asked. And they weren't asking, they were demanding. I took out my pen. I signed the transition agreement, acknowledging my new role. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my primary AWS administrative token, and slid it across the table toward Preston. "The production credentials are valid," I said quietly. "The system is fully operational." Preston took the token, nodding with a look of professional satisfaction. "Thank you, Conrad. We'll handle the migration from here. We want to show the board the cost savings before the pilot integration goes live next week." I stood up, walked back to my office, and began packing my personal belongings into a single cardboard box. My textbooks on advanced cryptanalysis, a framed photo of Lydia and Tristan at our first trade show, and a vintage mechanical keyboard. Tristan walked in a few minutes later, holding his box, his face pale but calm. "Are we going to fight this, Dad?" Tristan asked. I put my hand on my son's shoulder. I looked through the glass wall at Preston Cole, who was already gathering the engineering team in the central bullpen, projecting slide decks showing his cloud migration strategy. "We aren't going to fight them in their boardroom, Tristan," I said. "We're going to let them run the system. Pack your things. Let's go home." We walked out of the building into the cold autumn rain. I didn't look back. Garrett Kincaid and Preston Cole believed they had outmaneuvered me with corporate bylaws and cloud architecture slides. But they had just taken the wheel of a high-performance machine without reading the manual, and they were heading straight for a wall. The morning after my termination, Lydia, Tristan, and I sat in the office of Reginald Thorne. Reginald's office was a quiet, wood-paneled suite in San Jose, filled with the scent of old paper and leather-bound law volumes. He was a veteran contract lawyer who had spent 30 years watching tech founders get chewed up by venture capitalists. As he reviewed our original formation documents, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "They played a high-stakes game, Conrad," Reginald said, leaning back in his leather chair. "But they made a critical assumption that is about to cost them everything." When Lydia and I first developed Centenax 8, we knew the risks of venture capital. We had seen too many founders lose their intellectual property to predatory board takeovers. Under Reginald's guidance, we didn't assign the patents for Centenax 8 directly to Vespera Cryptics. Instead, we created a separate entity called Mercer Patents LLC. This family-owned LLC held the master patents and the source code. Vespera Cryptics only held a non-exclusive license to use the software. Reginald tapped his finger on Clause 11.4 of the licensing agreement, change of control. The clause was clear. If Vespera Cryptics underwent a change of control without the unanimous written consent of the original founding board members, defined explicitly as Lydia and myself, the licensing terms would modify automatically. Because Garrett Kincaid had bypassed us by diluting our voting power to push the acquisition through, Clause 11.4 triggered the moment the merger papers were filed with the Delaware Secretary of State. Under the triggered terms, the monthly licensing fee for Centenax 8 scaled up by 1,000% from $25,000 a month to $250,000. The contract stated that if any adjusted invoice remained unpaid for 14 calendar days, the license to run the software would terminate automatically. Lydia sent the invoice for $250,000 via Certified Mail and Electronic Data Interchange, or EDI, to Vespera's corporate billing system. Garrett Kincaid didn't ignore it by accident. He and Pierce Hathaway received it, reviewed it, and intentionally directed their accounts payable team to block the payment. Garrett's corporate attorneys argued that paying the invoice would legally admit the validity of Clause 11.4's rate hike. They planned to let the merger finalize, let the bank integration run, and then file a lawsuit in Delaware to challenge the contract's validity, arguing that the rate hike was an unenforceable penalty. They believed we would never dare to enforce the termination clause because a system shutdown would invite a massive lawsuit. They assumed we would fold under the threat of litigations. They didn't understand that I had no intention of arguing with them in court. I was simply going to let the software enforce itself. Centenax 8 was built to meet strict SOC 2 compliance standards. Every 24 hours, the software daemon running on Vespera's AWS production servers made an encrypted API query to our private key management server, hosted at kms.mercerpatents.com. The purpose of this handshake was to retrieve a daily cryptographically signed license token, verified against our private key. This was a standard, fully documented digital rights management practice, written explicitly into the product's SLA and integration manuals provided to both Vespera and Meridian Union Bank. It wasn't a secret backdoor, it was a security standard. If the validation check failed, the software was programmed to protect database integrity at all costs. It would enter failsafe encryption hold, locking the key cache inside the physical HSM modules, refusing to accept new write requests, and transitioning the entire database cluster into a read-only state. On day 15, the grace period expired. The $250,000 invoice remained unpaid. Lydia updated the status of Vespera's license to terminate it on the Mercer Patents validation server. At midnight, Vespera's production servers initiated their daily check. The validation server returned a license expired status. The software gracefully shut down encryption rights to prevent data corruption. The transaction throughput graph on Vespera's network dropped to zero. At the same time, Preston Cole was executing his cloud migration script, attempting to move the key management system from our physical cloud HSM cluster to the software-based AWS KMS. But because the database was now locked in fail-safe encryption hold and the cloud HSM was in a secure lockdown state, the physical HSM interpreted Preston's software migration attempt as a hardware-level key extraction attack. Following its pre-configured security policy, the cloud HSM initiated key zeroization. It wiped the local master keys from its physical memory partition, rendering the database a vault with no keyhole. I sat in my dark living room, watching the connection logs on my personal computer. The entire Meridian Union Bank pilot transaction pipeline was completely frozen. My phone began to ring. I set it face down on the table. The automated clock had run out, and Garrett Kincaid's corporate maneuvering had just cost him his entire board. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the transaction backlog at Meridian Union Bank had crossed the $40 million mark. The pilot program was completely frozen. Merchants across 3 states were getting transaction failed errors when processing customer debit cards. Meridian's Security Operations Center was in full panic mode, thinking they were under a distributed denial-of-service attack. At Vespera's headquarters, Preston Cole had ordered the remaining engineering team into the office. I heard later from one of my old senior developers that Preston was pale, staring at the AWS console in disbelief. The cloud HSM partition was empty. The keys were gone, and because he had bypassed our hardware security guidelines, he had no way to restore them. He had assumed the HSM was just another software container he could spin up at will. He didn't have the offline master backup recovery seed, the physical USB hardware token sitting in my desk drawer at home. That was when the phone call from Garrett Kincaid finally came through. I let it ring 3 times before I slid the bar to answer. I didn't say a word. I just listened. "Conrad, what the hell did you do to the system?" Garrett roared, his voice cracking with rage. "We have $40 million in transaction queues backed up, and Meridian is threatening to pull out of the merger. You're going to jail, Conrad. I'm filing a report with the FBI and the SEC for economic sabotage. I'll make sure you never see the light of day." I kept my breathing steady, my voice flat. I didn't raise my pitch by a single decibel. "I didn't do anything to your servers, Garrett," I said. "I haven't accessed Vespera's system since you confiscated my credentials and escorted me out of the building. What you are experiencing is the standard, documented security behavior of Centenax 8. The software detected that its license was legally terminated because you defaulted on the invoice, and your new CTO triggered key zeroization by attempting an unauthorized key migration on a locked HSM. It's a standard security compliance feature." "What license fee?" Garrett screamed. "We bought your company. We own the software. You bought Vespera Cryptics, Garrett. You didn't buy Mercer Patents LLC. Our license agreement has a change of control clause. The moment the merger went through without our consent, the fee adjusted. Lydia sent the invoice to your accounts payable queue 15 days ago. You ignored it. The contract states that if the invoice is unpaid for 14 days, the license automatically terminates. If you want to discuss this further, contact my attorney, Reginald Thorne." I hung up the phone. Garrett didn't call Reginald Thorne. Instead, he chose to double down. Ironclad Capital's law firm filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order in the Federal District Court of Northern California. They claimed that Lydia and I were withholding critical infrastructure assets, causing irreparable harm to the national banking system, and demanding the court force us to hand over the master decryption keys. The virtual court hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. I sat next to Reginald Thorne in his office, looking at the grid of faces on the screen. Garrett Kincaid sat in his sleek office, flanked by 3 senior partners from a white shoe law firm. Preston Cole was next to him, looking sweating and nervous. Ironclad's lead attorney stood up and presented a dramatic argument. He accused me of holding a federal depository institution hostage. He used big, threatening terms, trying to paint me as a rogue developer who had installed a backdoor in the software to extort the company. When it was our turn, Reginald Thorne stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply shared his screen and presented our documents. First, the original IP licensing agreement, highlighting Clause 11.4. Second, the public Delaware M&A filing showing that Vespera Cryptics had indeed undergone a change of control. Third, the corporate registry proving that Lydia and I were the sole managing members of Mercer Patents LLC and that we had never signed a change of control waiver. This is not a case of computer fraud or sabotage, Your Honor. Reginald said calmly to the camera. This is a simple contract dispute. Vespera Cryptics defaulted on their software license. The judge, Judge Margaret Campbell, was a sharp, no-nonsense jurist who had spent decades presiding over complex patent and contract disputes in Silicon Valley. She reviewed the documents for 10 quiet minutes. Finally, Judge Campbell looked up. This is a critical financial system, she said, fixing her gaze on the screen. The court will not allow a regional banking network to remain paralyzed. I am proposing a compromise. Ironclad Capital has 24 hours to deposit the disputed $250,000 licensing fee, along with Conrad Mercer's disputed $5 million earn-out bonus, into the court's escrow registry. Upon confirmation of the deposit, Conrad Mercer will provide a temporary 30-day operating token to restore the system while we proceed to trial. I looked at Reginald. That was a fair legal compromise. But I noticed another face on the screen. Harlan Finch, the senior founding partner of Ironclad Capital, who had been quietly watching the hearing. The moment Judge Campbell mentioned proceeding to trial, Harlan Finch's expression changed. He knew exactly what a federal contract trial meant. It meant entering the discovery phase. Under U.S. federal civil procedure, during discovery, my lawyers would have the legal right to demand access to every single internal email, text message, and memo sent by Garrett Kincaid and the board members over the last 12 months. They would find the email threads where Garrett explicitly discussed diluting my shares, demoting me, and intentionally delaying the integration to create a pretext for termination with cause. It would expose Ironclad Capital to criminal charges for mail and wire fraud, SEC sanctions for securities fraud, and ruin the fund's reputation permanently. Settling now would cost them millions. Going to trial would destroy them. Harlan Finch leaned forward, tapped Garrett Kincaid on the shoulder, and whispered something in his ear. Garrett's face went pale. Harlan then signaled their lead attorney. Your Honor, Ironclad's attorney said, his voice suddenly losing its aggressive edge. We request a 2-hour recess to consult with our client regarding a potential settlement. Judge Campbell nodded. Recess granted. We will reconvene at noon. The screen went black. Reginald Thorne turned to me, a quiet smile on his face. They just realized what's in their own outboxes, Conrad, he said. Get ready. They're about to write a very big check. Harlan Finch did not wait for the court recess to end. At 11 o'clock, he arrived at Reginald Thorne's office in San Jose. He was alone, carrying a single leather briefcase, and looking like a man who had already done the math. Harlan was 62 years old, a veteran of the private equity world who understood that in business, pride is a luxury you cannot afford when your reputation is on the line. He sat down at the conference table, looked at Lydia and me, and got straight to the point. Let's skip the posturing, Conrad, Harlan said, opening his folder. If we go to trial, your lawyers will demand discovery. I know what Garrett Kincaid put in his emails, and I have no interest in letting the SEC or a federal prosecutor review our internal communications. A trial will destroy the Meridian Union merger and wipe out our current fund's capital. I'm here to settle this today. What are your terms? Reginald Thorne slid our contract across the table. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. First, Ironclad Capital would buy the master patents and the source code for Centenax 8 from Mercer Patents LLC for $12 million. Second, Ironclad would pay my $5 million earn-out bonus in cash immediately, bypassing the 90-day integration window. Third, Ironclad would buy out my 50,000 restricted stock units at their peak pre-merger valuation, totaling $3 million. Fourth, a full mutual release of all liabilities for myself, Lydia, and Tristan, ensuring no future legal retaliation. Fifth, a severance package for Tristan equal to 1 full year of his senior engineering salary. And finally, the immediate termination of Garrett Kincaid and Preston Cole from Vespera Cryptics and Ironclad Capital for gross negligence. Harlan Finch read the document. He didn't flinch, and he didn't try to negotiate. He knew that $20 million was a drop in the bucket compared to the collapse of a $200 million banking merger and the destruction of a $150 million private equity fund. He took out his pen and signed the agreement. Garrett and Preston have already been relieved of their duties, Harlan said, sliding the document back to Reginald. Their access credentials have been revoked. Now, where is the recovery key? Lydia checked her laptop, monitoring our bank account. We sat in silence for 45 minutes, waiting for the federal wire transfers to clear. When the notification finally popped up, showing a cleared balance of $20 million. Lydia gave me a nod. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy, aluminum-cased USB drive containing the offline master backup recovery seed, and placed it on the table. "This will restore the HSM partition and decrypt the transaction logs," I said. "Your cloud engineers can run the initialization script in the root directory." Harlan took the drive, stood up, and shook my hand. "You're a smart man, Conrad," he said. "It's a pity we couldn't work together." "It is," I replied. "But you should have checked the contract before you let Garrett run the board." Harlan walked out of the office. By that evening, Vespera Cryptics had restored their databases, and the Meridian Union Bank pilot integration went back online. But Lydia, Tristan, and I weren't finished. We didn't take our $20 million and retire. We knew the technology sector too well, and we knew Vespera's internal weaknesses. 2 weeks later, we leased an office space in a building directly across the street from Vespera Cryptics headquarters. We hung a sign on the glass door. Centenax Technologies, Inc. Preston Cole had fired or alienated our core engineering team during his disastrous cloud migration attempt. The senior developers, system administrators, and database architects who had worked with me for a decade were tired of Ironclad's micromanagement. I reached out to them. I offered them higher salaries, equity in our new company, and a work culture that actually respected engineers. Within a month, 80% of Vespera's core technical talent had resigned and walked across the street to join Centenax Technologies. Ironclad Capital owned the patents to Centenax 8, but they had no engineers left who understood how to maintain, update, or scale the code. They had a static asset frozen in time. Meanwhile, our team went to work. With $20 million in capital and the best cryptography minds in the valley, we developed Centenax 9, a completely redesigned, decentralized transactions security protocol that bypassed cloud HSM entirely, utilizing next-generation multi-party computation. Within a year, Centenax Technologies launched its new platform. We approached Vespera's largest enterprise clients, offering them a faster, more secure, and cheaper solution, backed by the engineers who had built the original system. One by one, Vespera's clients migrated to our platform. Garrett Kincaid and Preston Cole had tried to use their corporate bylaws, voting dilution, and legal threats to take my life's work. They thought that because they controlled the board seats, they controlled the value. But they forgot that in the technology world, the value isn't in the building, the brand, or the signed papers in Delaware. The value is in the minds of the people who write the code, and you can't dilute that.